Hello, my name's Jim Scone. I'm coming to this conversation, I guess, from the study of literature, the study of history, and philosophy of science and history of science as well. I'm currently completing a PhD on the representation and understanding of soil in the 19th century, in the mid 19th century, in both science and the novel of that period, and how the understanding of soil is changing in those years, and indeed how the soil itself is changing, how the relationship between the thing itself and its understanding is changing what soil is and kind of can become, I guess. And I'll sort of hopefully make that a little clearer in terms of what I mean by that in a moment. I have been so enjoying all the pieces on the Love and Soil site, and I guess I wanted to come to my contribution from the word soil, really. And there's been some wonderful contributions on the word love, and I think the word soil is a similarly capacious kind of word. It means a lot, and it's kind of synonyms and cognates and all of this encompass a lot of things, and I guess I want to talk about that a little bit and how I see that. Some of you may know that the verb form of soil, as in to soil, to defile or pollute with sin, is the Old French has it, comes from the early 1200s, whereas the noun form of soil, soil as the thing, is actually a more recent word. It's from the 1300s, and I always think that's an interesting starting point for any discussion that or not starting point, but an interesting just point of discussion, really, that the thing we call soil and the word that we use to describe it is itself has an older history of meaning dirtiness and pollution, in a sense, and that seems to encapsulate something of the crisis we're in, doesn't it? I think, and I was just reading Ewan's piece, and this same understanding, these false dichotomies between human and non-human, between nature and culture, between life and death, and between, I guess, organic and inorganic or inert. That artificial distinction of soil as dirt seems to encapsulate so much of that, doesn't it? And it also, I think, more hopefully, I think soil is a way to think past that, because of course soil collapses all these dichotomies, doesn't it? Soil is both life and death. It is the decomposing organic matter that every living thing will one day become. It is also the life from which that springs, and it is indeed full of life. And one of the most amazing areas of science, I think, at the moment, bar none, is the science of the microbiome and the unbelievable revelations that are coming about the interrelationships, unbelievably complex situations and relationships in soil, about how plants access nutrients and all these various things, which is, and Merlin Sheldrake's new book, Entangled Life, is such a good exploration of that. And it also collapses these other binaries like nature and culture as well. I think the word culture is another interesting word in this sense, and coming from cultivation and indeed working the soil and coming to mean so much, in fact, indeed quite the opposite of that, culture being the sort of the height of human achievement in the city, say. And it's this relationship actually that someone like Raymond Williams would talk about an awful lot, in terms of how that word moves from meaning tilling the soil to sort of tilling the mind, almost, or improving the mind in that sense. There's another, and indeed the organic and inorganic distinction too, I think, is itself bound up with all of this as well. And one of the reasons I look at the 19th century, and I'm so interested in the 19th century as an important stage in how soil has been understood, and indeed what soil now is in many ways, in terms of soil being treated so terribly in terms of the Green Revolution, in terms of the application of pesticides and chemicals, is this mid-19th century moment when there's a German chemist called Justus von Liebig, and he's one of several people working on soil at this time. And in 1840, he publishes Organic Chemistry and its Applications to Agriculture and Physiology, which is a dense sounding book, and it is at times a slightly dense book perhaps, but it's a very important book, because what he argues in that is that soil is inorganic. The existing understanding sort of from the earlier 1800s is that humus somehow gives plants the carbon they need to grow, and that the sort of vitalism and nature philosophy coming from the German tradition, viewing soil then very much as a vital space, and that somehow the life force in the living frame comes into the soil and then passes to new living frames. Liebig, as a sort of, he wouldn't have seen himself as a materialist, but he has a far more sort of rational, scientific, reductionist, and indeed kind of, I suppose, materialist view of things in that sense. Said that was a load of rubbish, and that soil is inorganic, and all that plants get from the soil is the inorganic kind of phosphates, etc., in an inorganic form from the soil. The carbon coming from the air, which of course, in some sense there was some truth there as well, right? Now it's hard in a sense to see how that idea ever really took hold, that soil was inorganic. It's so obviously not in many ways. But what Liebig's ideas did, and he was arguing very much that factories could produce all the fertilizers, all the inorganic constituents that plants could ever need, and that farmers might then buy those and put them on the soil instead of using organic manures and rotations and things such as this to help maintain fertility. What he was able to do, I think, was to create a model that really plugged into the financial economy. And he really kind of, if we think about the great industrialization of Britain in the 19th century and Victorian period, Liebig's idea really made soil an extension of the factory. The field became somehow, it could be drawn in to this industrial economy, whereby plants would be weighed, measured, and analysed to see how much of certain nutrients any crop took off, and then that could be put back in very straightforwardly by the farmer, then measuring exactly what he needed to restore the field to the exact constituents that he'd taken from it, and buy those from the factory. And that was Liebig's exact argument, really. And I think part of the reason why his idea, his inorganic mineral theory, it kind of took hold as an idea. It's a concept more than anything, I would say, in the 19th century. While there was a sort of multi-million-pound factory fertilizer business by the end of the 19th century, clearly the key changes happened in the 20th century. But one of the reasons why Liebig's thinking is interesting to go back to now is because it does offer, I think, something of the economies of scale that farmers are being forced to work with, right, in these issues through the second half of the 20th century. And there's been some very, I think, welcome and important reflections on the discussion, on the Love and Soil discussion, around farmers being blamed for the changes that for the death of the soil, etc., etc. And indeed from the degradation of the countryside and the amount of animals and plants and birds that can live in it and live good lives. But of course, what is happening maybe more truthfully in that sense is that farmers are being forced in one way or another. It's the economies of scale, isn't it? It's go big, scrub out your hedgerows, get your massive combine harvesters in, apply your pesticides, apply your fertilizers, grow vast amounts of crops in a monoculture at huge scale, or stop farming and let someone else do it because it becomes the only way to make a living. It's a really important realization, that I think, and it's essential that farmers aren't then, you know, seen as the bad guys. In many senses, farmers, I think, are the victims actually of a system in many ways. But there's also hope, right? And this is kind of what I wanted to finish on, really, and not make it too doom and gloom, is that I find soil intensely wonderful to think with and to be with, to work with in whatever way you think about that. I mean, I'm sure a great many of us, if we're not working with the soil in the sense of cultivation, maybe we do in our spare time or have an allotment or whatever it may be, and you can't help but be quite almost meditative, I find, at least, when thinking about soil or thinking with soil, because it as I say, collapses these dichotomies between nature and culture, between life and death. And I think the one that it really is so helpful now that a soil allows us to think with is the relationship between sort of local and global, or maybe to think about it in the terms of soil and the terms of earth, between earth beneath our feet and the earth, the whole earth. And there's something inscribed in language there, isn't there, about how the same word means the particular the particularity that is beneath our feet, that soil that is indeed probably in its exact physico-chemical biology, etc., unlike no other soil. Exactly, there's an amazing particularity in soils across a region, never mind across a world. But at the same time, it speaks to the universal. It speaks to the world itself, the biosphere, Earth, the entity in which we all exist and all life exists. And it's that distinction, that movement between the immediate experience of soil and the global resonances of that experience that, of course, speak to all the ecological crises, socio-ecological crises that we face. The terrible realization that when we turn the ignition in our car, that's doing harm, and that by grinding a coffee in the morning, electricity is being used which is doing harm, and that coffee's come from somewhere, and all of this stuff. But to be aware of that is such an important step, right? And that's where soil gets us. I think you can't not be aware of it with soil. And I like to think that soil is a way to think past some of those exploitative or extractive relationships too, right? And indeed some of the differences which separate people as well, because soil is, in the same way as it being the particular substance beneath our feet and the universal earth in which we live, it is also the common human experience of living on earth, standing on soil, right? But at the same time, no two soils are understood in quite the same way. And I kind of feel, naively perhaps, but with an intense hope, that in that wonderful diversity of experience, and that wonderful, all the world's cosmologies and all the world's different ways of viewing soil and understanding soil and relating in and through soil, there is hope for the world that we need to build, right? The world that isn't exploitative, that isn't extractive, that doesn't do so much harm, but that fosters all those other values that we know are so vital: care, health, fairness, ecology. And that's why, however much it can be depressing, I find, in many ways, reading the news, and sometimes I find even doing my PhD can be a depressing old thing, in the sense of becoming so aware of the harm that some of these ideas around soil have done to soil and indeed to people and all life. there's always that hope, and it is an intense hope, and I firmly believe in it. So thank you for listening.